At 6:47 a.m. on March 15, 2024, Serenity Thompson was stirring sugar into her coffee when she noticed something impossible. The steam rising from her cup had frozen mid-air, creating delicate white ribbons that hung motionless in space like crystallized breath. She blinked hard, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her after another sleepless night. But the steam remained perfectly still, defying every law of physics she'd ever known. She walked to her kitchen window, and what she saw outside made her legs buckle. Her neighbor's golden retriever was suspended 3 feet off the ground, caught mid-leap over a fence, its fur rippling in waves that would never complete their motion. A jogger stood frozen on the sidewalk, 1 foot hovering inches above the pavement, sweat droplets hanging in the air around his face like tiny diamonds. Even the morning breeze had stopped, leaving the world wrapped in a silence so complete, it felt like being inside a tomb. This is the documented account of what happened to a 29-year-old art teacher from Phoenix, Arizona, on the morning time forgot to move forward. If you're someone who understands that reality operates on frequencies most people never tune into, then what I'm about to share will shatter everything you think you know about the nature of time, consciousness, and the power locked inside the human heart. Because what Serenity discovered in those impossible hours wasn't just that time could stop, but that love could make it start again. The security cameras throughout the city recorded everything. The medical examinations that followed documented changes in her brain that neurologists still can't explain. And the witness testimonies from what happened after time returned have been verified by people who never met each other, but all tell the exact same impossible story. Some experiences are so profound, they can only be understood by those ready to see beyond the veil of ordinary reality. This is one of them. Serenity had always been a creature of routine. Every morning at 6:30 sharp, her alarm would pierce through the Arizona dawn, and she'd shuffle to the kitchen in her oversized UCLA sweatshirt, the one with the paint stains that told the story of 1,000 art projects with her elementary students. The coffee maker would gurgle to life, filling her small apartment with the rich aroma that promised another day of controlled chaos in classroom 3B. But this morning felt different before anything impossible happened. The air itself seemed thicker, charged with an electricity that made her skin tingle as she moved through her familiar rituals. Even her cat Picasso was acting strange, sitting perfectly still by the window instead of his usual morning sprint around the apartment. His green eyes were fixed on something outside that she couldn't see, his tail twitching with an anxiety that seemed to vibrate through the walls. She poured the steaming coffee into her favorite mug, the ceramic one her students had painted for her birthday, covered in tiny handprints and the words, "Best teacher ever," in crooked purple letters. As she lifted the spoon to stir in her usual 2 sugars, that's when she saw it. The steam wasn't rising anymore. It hung in the air like frozen silk, each wisp perfectly preserved in mid-ascent, creating an impossible sculpture of vapor that should have dissipated but instead remained suspended like it was trapped in glass. Her hand trembled as she set down the spoon, the metallic clink echoing strangely in the suddenly heavy silence. She waved her fingers through the frozen steam, expecting it to disperse, but her hand passed through it without disturbing a single tendril. The coffee in her cup was still hot, still steaming, but the steam itself refused to obey gravity or time, or any rule she'd ever understood about how the world worked. The silence hit her then. Complete, absolute silence. No hum from the refrigerator, no distant traffic from the street below, no chirping from the birds that usually gathered in the mesquite tree outside her bedroom window. Even her own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened into something that swallowed sound. She moved to the window that faced downtown Phoenix, her bare feet silent on the cold tile floor. What she saw outside made her grip the windowsill so hard her knuckles went white. The jogger she saw every morning, a man in his 50s who always waved when he passed her building, was frozen mid-stride on the sidewalk below. 1 foot hovered 6 inches above the concrete, his running shoe suspended in air, while beads of sweat hung around his head like a constellation of tiny stars that would never fall. Across the street, Mrs. Martinez was frozen in her garden, her watering can tilted at an angle that should have been pouring water onto her roses, but instead created a perfect arc of crystalline droplets suspended in midair. Each drop caught the morning sunlight, refracting it into tiny rainbows that hung motionless in space. Serenity's breath fogged the window, but even her breath seemed wrong, too heavy, too visible in the 70-degree Arizona morning. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes, willing this to be some kind of elaborate dream, the kind that feels so real you're convinced you're awake until you actually wake up. But when she opened them again, the impossible scene remained unchanged. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter, its screen black and unresponsive. She pressed the power button frantically, but nothing happened. The digital clock on her microwave displayed 6:47 a.m. in green numbers that seemed to mock her with their stillness. Even the second hand on the wall clock had stopped moving, frozen between the 8 and the 9 like it was afraid to complete its journey. The panic started in her chest, a flutter that quickly became a pounding that seemed to shake her entire ribcage. She ran to her front door, fumbling with the locks with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy and foreign. The hallway outside her apartment was as eerily still as everything else. Mr. Chen from 4B was frozen halfway through his morning Tai Chi routine in the courtyard, his body twisted in a graceful pose that he would hold forever unless something changed. She ran down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, her footsteps echoing in the stairwell like gunshots. The lobby was a museum of frozen moments. The security guard, Tony, sat behind his desk with a newspaper half raised to his face, his eyes focused on words he would never finish reading. The elevator doors were caught half open, as if time had grabbed them mid-close and refused to let go. Outside, the world had become a photograph that she could walk through but not change. A school bus sat in the middle of the intersection, its red lights flashing in a rhythm that had stopped mid-pulse. Inside, she could see children's faces pressed against the windows, their expressions frozen in laughter or conversation, or the 1,000 small emotions that fill a typical school morning. She walked into the street, something she'd never dared to do during rush hour, and stood directly in front of a city bus that should have run her down, but instead loomed over her like a sleeping giant. The driver's hands gripped the steering wheel, his eyes focused straight ahead, unblinking and unseeing. A woman in the front seat was frozen mid-yawn, her mouth open in a perfect O of exhaustion that would never find relief. The silence was becoming unbearable. She screamed, a sound that tore from her throat and seemed to die just inches from her lips, swallowed by the thick air that surrounded everything. She screamed again, this time calling for help, for anyone, for some sign that she wasn't completely alone in this impossible world. But her voice fell flat against the stillness, absorbed by whatever force had turned her reality into a living photograph. She ran through the streets of downtown Phoenix, past frozen cars and motionless pedestrians, past birds suspended in mid-flight and fountain water that hung in perfect arcs above empty pools. Every step she took felt like a violation of some cosmic rule she didn't understand, as if she was the only thing in existence that time had forgotten to freeze. By the time she reached the park where she sometimes sat during her lunch breaks, her lungs were burning and her legs felt like jelly. She collapsed onto a bench next to a man who was frozen mid-bite of his breakfast sandwich, and that's when the full weight of her situation hit her like a physical blow. She was alone, completely, utterly alone in a world full of people who couldn't see her, couldn't hear her, couldn't acknowledge that she existed at all. The tears came then, hot and fast, sliding down her cheeks and dropping onto her hands like the only things in the entire world that were still obeying the laws of gravity. She cried for the impossibility of it all, for the loneliness that felt like it might swallow her whole, and for the growing certainty that she was losing her mind in the most elaborate and terrifying way possible. But as her tears fell onto the still earth beneath the bench, something changed in the quality of the silence around her. It became expectant, pregnant with possibility, as if the world was holding its breath and waiting for her to understand something she hadn't yet grasped. And in that moment of absolute despair, sitting alone in a world that had forgotten how to move, Serenity Thompson heard the first whisper of something that would change everything she thought she knew about reality, about time, and about the power hidden in the deepest chambers of the human heart. The voice came like a warm breeze in the absolute stillness, not through her ears, but directly into the center of her mind, bypassing every logical filter she'd ever built to protect herself from the impossible. It was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but carried the weight of something ancient and infinitely patient, like the sound of wind through canyons that had stood for thousands of years. The world only breathes when you choose love. Serenity's head snapped up so quickly her neck cracked, her tear-stained eyes scanning the frozen park for any sign of movement, any indication that someone else had joined her in this suspended reality. But everything remained exactly as it had been. The jogger in the distance was still caught mid-stride, the pigeons still hung motionless above the fountain, and the man beside her continued his eternal bite of breakfast sandwich. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. The silence swallowed her words before they could travel more than a few inches from her lips. "You know who I am," the voice replied. And somehow she did. Not in any way she could explain or defend in a court of law, but in the same way she knew her own heartbeat or the taste of her own tears. This presence had been with her before, in moments she'd dismissed as imagination or coincidence. The feeling she got sometimes when she was alone in her classroom after the children had left. That sense of being watched over by something benevolent and vast. The whisper she'd heard the night her father died, telling her he was safe and loved beyond measure. "This isn't real," she said, standing up on shaky legs and backing away from the bench as if distance could somehow separate her from her own thoughts. "I'm having a breakdown. I'm hallucinating. This is what happens when you drink too much coffee and don't get enough sleep and spend too much time alone with your own thoughts." The voice came again, and this time it carried the unmistakable sound of gentle laughter, like water running over smooth stones. "Reality is far more flexible than you've been taught to believe, Serenity. What you're experiencing isn't madness. It's revelation. If you're still with me at this point, it means you're exactly the kind of person who understands that reality is far more magical than we've been taught. There's a growing community of us here who recognize that these aren't coincidences. They're miracles. Subscribe to this channel because what happens next in Serenity's story is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about consciousness, time, and the power of love itself. Trust me, you don't want to miss a single detail of how this impossible transformation unfolds. Walk with me, the voice said, and suddenly Serenity felt a gentle pull in her chest, like an invisible thread connecting her heart to something beyond her understanding. There are things you need to see, wounds you need to heal, and choices you need to understand before time can flow again. And she found herself moving without consciously deciding to walk, her feet carrying her through the frozen streets with a purpose she didn't yet comprehend. The voice guided her past the motionless traffic, past the suspended birds and crystallized fountain water, toward a part of the city she'd been avoiding for 3 years, her childhood neighborhood, where memories lived in the shadows of familiar houses, and every street corner held the ghost of who she used to be. As they walked, the voice began to speak in a tone that was both teaching and healing, like a therapist and a sage rolled into one cosmic presence. Time isn't a river that flows in one direction, Serenity. It's an ocean, and consciousness is the boat that navigates it. What you call the past and the future are simply different shores of the same vast water. Right now, you're anchored in a moment between moments, where all possibilities exist simultaneously. "But why me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper in the heavy air. "Why am I the only one who's not frozen? What makes me so special?" "You're not special because you're awake," the voice replied. "You're awake because you're ready to become special. For 3 years, you've been living like a ghost in your own life, going through the motions, but never truly inhabiting the moments. Your heart has been frozen longer than this world has been still." The words hit her like physical blows, each one finding its target in the tender places she'd been protecting, with carefully constructed walls of routine and emotional numbness. She thought about her life over the past 3 years, how she'd retreated into the safety of her classroom and her small apartment, how she'd stopped returning calls from friends, stopped dating, stopped dreaming about anything beyond the next day's lesson plans. They were walking down Maple Street now, past the houses where she'd played as a child, where she'd learned to ride a bike and had her first kiss and cried her first real tears of heartbreak. Everything looked exactly as it had when she was growing up, frozen not just in this impossible moment, but in the amber of her own memory. "Stop here," the voice said, as they reached a small house with a garden full of roses that should have been swaying in the morning breeze, but instead stood like red soldiers at attention. "Do you remember this place?" Of course she remembered. This was where Mrs. Patterson had lived, the elderly woman who taught her to paint when she was 7 years old. the woman who'd seen something in a shy little girl that no one else had noticed, who'd spent countless afternoons showing her how to mix colors and capture light and translate the emotions in her heart onto canvas. She died alone, Serenity whispered, the memory cutting through her like a blade. She got sick, and I meant to visit her, but I was busy with college and then work and then life, and I kept putting it off until it was too late. The last thing she ever gave me was a paintbrush set for my birthday, and I never even used it. Look closer, the voice said gently. What do you see in the window? Serenity approached the house with careful steps, her heart pounding as she peered through the front window into the living room she remembered so well. There, frozen in time like everything else, was Mrs. Patterson herself, exactly as she'd been on the day Serenity had meant to visit but never did. She was sitting in her favorite armchair, a half-finished painting on an easel beside her, her weathered hands holding a brush that would never complete its stroke. But it was the painting that made Serenity's knees buckle. It was a portrait of a young girl with dark hair and sad eyes, standing in a field of wildflowers with paintbrushes scattered at her feet like fallen dreams. It was her, Mrs. Patterson had been painting her memory, trying to capture something beautiful about the little girl who'd grown up and forgotten how to create, how to love, how to be fully alive. She never stopped believing in you, the voice said, and Serenity could hear tears in words that had no physical form. Even when you stopped believing in yourself, even when you decided that disappointment was safer than hope. Love doesn't die just because we stop paying attention to it. It waits. It watches. It hopes for the day we'll remember who we were meant to be. The tears came again, but this time they felt different. Not the desperate tears of panic and confusion she'd cried in the park, but something deeper and more necessary, like rain after a long drought. She pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window and whispered an apology that was 3 years too late, but somehow still reached its intended recipient. This is just the beginning, the voice said, as they turned away from the house and continued their journey through the frozen streets. There are more wounds to heal, more love to remember, more choices to understand. The world stopped moving because your heart stopped growing. But every beat of love you choose to feel brings time 1 second closer to flowing again. They walked deeper into the maze of memory and regret, past the high school where she'd given up her dreams of becoming a professional artist because someone told her it wasn't practical, past the coffee shop where she'd had her last real conversation with her brother before pride and stubbornness built a wall between them that neither had been brave enough to tear down. With each step, Serenity began to understand that this impossible day wasn't a punishment or a breakdown, or even a miracle in the traditional sense. It was an invitation, an opportunity to step outside the flow of time and see her life from a perspective that was usually reserved for the dying or the divinely inspired. "Where are we going?" she asked, as they turned onto a street she hadn't walked down in over a year. "To the place where your heart broke so completely that you decided it was safer to stop feeling altogether," the voice replied. "To the moment where time first stopped for you, long before the world joined you in that stillness." And as they approached the apartment building where her ex-fiancé Marcus still lived, where the engagement ring she'd thrown at his feet in a moment of fury and betrayal still lay hidden beneath his couch like a small, glittering accusation, Serenity realized that this journey through frozen time was about to become a journey through frozen emotions. The hardest part wasn't going to be understanding why time had stopped. It was going to be finding the courage to let it start again. The apartment building loomed before them like a monument to everything Serenity had tried to forget. The red brick facade was exactly the same, down to the crack in the third-floor window that Marcus had always meant to fix but never did. Even the smell was preserved in this frozen moment, the mixture of desert sage and car exhaust that had once meant home, but now felt like walking into a museum of her own broken dreams. "I can't go in there," she whispered, her feet rooted to the sidewalk as if the concrete had suddenly turned to quicksand. "I can't see him again, not like this. Not when I'm barely holding myself together. You're not going to see him as he is now," the voice said with infinite patience. "You're going to see him as he was then. And more importantly, you're going to see yourself as you were then. The version of you that made choices from fear instead of love." Before she could protest further, The world around her began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. The frozen figures on the street became translucent, ghost-like, and suddenly she was no longer standing outside the building, but inside apartment 3B, watching a scene she'd replayed in her mind 1,000 times, but never truly understood. It was September 23, 2021. She could tell because the calendar on Marcus's refrigerator was frozen on that date. The day circled in red ink with the words "ring shopping" written in his careful handwriting. But the Serenity from 3 years ago was standing in the living room, holding a different kind of ring entirely. The engagement ring he'd given her 6 months earlier. The one with the tiny diamond that had represented all their shared dreams of a future filled with Sunday morning pancakes and paint-stained fingers and children who would inherit her creativity and his kindness. "You never loved me." The past version of herself was screaming, her face twisted with a rage that seemed to consume all the oxygen in the room. "You loved the idea of me. You loved having a girlfriend who was quirky and artistic enough to make you feel interesting, but stable enough to never challenge you to actually grow." Marcus stood frozen mid-gesture, his hands reaching toward her in a plea she'd never allowed him to finish. His face was a map of confusion and desperation, the look of a man watching the person he loved disappear before his eyes and not understanding why. "That's not true," his frozen lips seemed to say, caught in the middle of words that Serenity had walked out on before they could be completed. "I love you exactly as you are. I love your paintings and your terrible cooking and the way you cry during car commercials. I love that you see magic in things other people overlook." But the past Serenity couldn't hear love in his words. All she could hear was the phone call she'd overheard him having with his mother the night before. The one where he'd said he was worried about her artistic career being sustainable, and maybe it would be good for her to have something more reliable to fall back on after they got married. "Watch this moment carefully," the voice said. And suddenly Serenity could see the scene from multiple angles, like a director studying a film from every possible perspective. "See how your past self is holding that ring not like a symbol of love, but like a weapon. See how she's using his concern for your financial security as evidence that he doesn't believe in your dreams." The memory continued to unfold in agonizing slow motion. Past Serenity hurled the ring at Marcus's feet with such force that it bounced off the hardwood floor and skittered under the couch, where it would remain hidden for the next 3 years, like a secret he was too heartbroken to retrieve. She could see now what she'd been blind to then, the way his shoulders collapsed, as if she'd physically struck him. The way his eyes filled with tears he was too proud to let fall. "I can't marry someone who thinks my dreams are hobbies," past Serenity declared, as she stormed toward the door. "I can't build a life with someone who sees my art as something cute that I'll grow out of once we have real responsibilities." "Please," Marcus called after her, his voice breaking on the single word. "Just let me explain what I meant. Let me show you the studio space I found downtown. Let me tell you about the gallery owner I met who wants to see your work." But the door was already slamming, and past Serenity was already running down the stairs, her heart pounding with the righteous fury of someone who believed she was protecting her dreams by destroying her love. "You couldn't hear him because you were listening to someone else entirely," the voice said gently. Who was really speaking in that moment? Suddenly, the apartment filled with echoes of other voices, ghostly whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Her father's voice, tired and bitter after another failed business venture. "Artists don't make money, Serenity. Pretty pictures don't pay the bills." Her high school art teacher, well-meaning but pragmatic. "You have talent, but talent doesn't guarantee success. Maybe consider art therapy or teaching as a backup plan." Her college roommate, jealous of her artistic abilities. "Must be nice to live in a fantasy world where you think you can make a living with finger paints." "Every voice except your own," the voice continued. "Every fear except the one you should have been listening to. The fear that you were about to walk away from someone who loved you enough to worry about your future, not because he didn't believe in your talent, but because he wanted to make sure you had every opportunity to share it with the world." The scene began to shift and change, showing her glimpses of the life she'd walked away from. Marcus, alone in the apartment after she left, crying over the hidden ring while scrolling through photos of her paintings on his phone. Marcus, 3 months later, standing in the downtown art studio he'd been planning to surprise her with, the lease already signed, the walls painted her favorite shade of cream. Marcus, on what would have been their wedding day, visiting her father's grave, and leaving a single white rose with a note that said, I would have loved her enough for both of us. No, Serenity whispered. Her hand pressed to her mouth as the weight of what she'd destroyed crashed over her like a tsunami. I didn't know. He never told me about the studio. He never said anything about a gallery. He was going to tell you the night you overheard him talking to his mother, the voice explained. He was asking for her advice on how to support your dreams without making you feel like he was trying to control them. He wanted to propose a second time, not with a ring, but with keys to a space where you could create freely, without worrying about rent or bills or any of the practical concerns that kept you up at night. The apartment dissolved around them, and suddenly they were standing in the art studio Marcus had leased but never given to her. It was perfect. Huge windows facing north for the best natural light, built-in storage for canvases and supplies, even a small kitchenette where she could have made her terrible coffee while she painted. The lease agreement was still sitting on the windowsill, signed in his name but with a line for her signature, waiting for a moment that never came. He kept paying the rent for 2 years, the voice said softly. Just in case you changed your mind. Just in case you came back and wanted to try again. The gallery owner still asks about you sometimes. She has your portfolio on her desk, the one Marcus brought her after you broke up. She's been waiting to meet you for 3 years. Serenity collapsed onto the paint-stained stool in the center of the studio, her entire body shaking with the magnitude of her mistake. She'd been so afraid of being diminished that she'd diminished herself, so terrified of having her dreams dismissed that she'd dismissed the one person who'd been trying to make them come true. "Can I fix this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "When time starts again, can I tell him I'm sorry? Can I explain that I was scared and stupid, and that I heard all the wrong voices because the right voice, my own voice, was too quiet to hear over the noise of my own fear? Time will start again, when you remember how to choose love over fear," the voice replied. "But first, there's one more place we need to visit. One more wound that needs healing before your heart can beat strong enough to wake up the world." The studio faded around them, and they were walking again through the frozen streets of Phoenix, past the motionless traffic and suspended birds, toward a destination that Serenity recognized with a sinking heart. The cemetery where her father was buried, where she hadn't visited since the day they put him in the ground, because she couldn't bear to face the weight of all the things they'd never said to each other. "The hardest forgiveness isn't the kind you give to other people," the voice said, as they approached the cemetery gates. "It's the kind you give to yourself. And sometimes, before you can forgive yourself, you have to forgive the people who taught you to be afraid of your own heart." The iron gates of Greenwood Cemetery stood open before them, and beyond them, Serenity could see her father's grave marker, simple gray granite with his name and dates and the words, "Beloved Father," that she'd chosen because she hadn't known how else to summarize a relationship that had been equal parts love and disappointment, encouragement and crushing doubt. "I'm not ready," she said, her feet refusing to carry her through those gates. "You've been ready for 3 years," the voice replied. "You just forgot that being ready doesn't mean being fearless. It means being brave enough to feel the fear and choose love anyway." And as they stepped into the cemetery where time had stopped and memory lived in the space between heartbeats, Serenity realized that the hardest conversation of her life was about to happen, with someone who could no longer speak back, but whose words still echoed in every choice she'd made since he died. The cemetery was a garden of frozen grief, where plastic flowers hung motionless in the desert air, and mourners stood like statues beside graves they would never finish visiting. But as Serenity walked between the headstones with the voice as her guide, she noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. The cemetery wasn't completely still. There, kneeling beside her father's grave, was a figure she recognized but hadn't expected to see. It was her brother Daniel, his weathered hands placing a fresh bouquet of sunflowers on the simple granite marker. The flowers were real, vibrant yellow petals that seemed to glow against the gray stone, and they were moving. A gentle breeze that touched nothing else in this frozen world rustled through their faces, and Daniel himself was breathing, blinking, alive in the way that everything else had forgotten how to be. "Danny?" she whispered, her voice carrying across the cemetery in a way it hadn't been able to anywhere else in this suspended reality. He looked up at the sound of his name, and when their eyes met across the rows of silent graves, His face broke into the same crooked smile he'd worn as a child, the one that had always made her forgive him for eating the last piece of cake or breaking her favorite crayon. But this smile was different now, weighted with 3 years of conversations they'd never had, and apologies that had lived only in the space between intention and action. "I was wondering when you'd finally show up," he said, rising from his knees and brushing dirt from his jeans. "Dad's been waiting for you both to have this conversation." Both? Serenity looked around the cemetery, expecting to see another unfrozen figure. But there was only Daniel, herself, and the endless rows of motionless mourners, caught in their private moments of grief. "Dad's here too," Daniel said gently, and suddenly the space around his grave began to shimmer like heat waves, revealing a third presence that had been there all along, invisible, but undeniably real. Robert Thompson stood beside his own headstone, looking exactly as he had on the last good day before the cancer took his strength, wearing the paint-stained flannel shirt he'd worn to every one of her childhood art shows. "Hello, little painter," he said, using the nickname that had always made her feel both cherished and diminished, loved and limited. "I've been hoping you'd visit." The sight of him hit her like a physical blow, dropping her to her knees on the cemetery grass that was somehow green and soft beneath her, while everything else remained frozen and lifeless. All the words she'd rehearsed for this moment, all the speeches about forgiveness and understanding that she'd planned to deliver to his gravestone, evaporated like morning dew under the weight of actually seeing his face again. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm sorry I stopped painting after you died. I'm sorry I threw away the easel you bought me for my 16th birthday. I'm sorry I let your doubts become my doubts, and your fears become my fears. I'm sorry I haven't visited because I was too angry and too guilty and too confused to know which one I was supposed to feel." Her father knelt beside her, his presence warm and solid despite the impossibility of his being there at all. "I'm the one who should be apologizing," he said, his voice carrying the weight of regrets that death hadn't erased. "I spent so much time trying to protect you from disappointment that I forgot to protect your dreams. I was so afraid you'd end up like me, bitter and broken by chasing something that never came true, that I tried to steer you toward safety instead of helping you find your courage." "You weren't bitter and broken," Serenity protested, finally looking up to meet his eyes. "You were practical. You were realistic. You were trying to save me from making your mistakes." "My mistake wasn't chasing my dreams," he said softly. "My mistake was giving up on them the first time someone told me they weren't good enough. I was a decent painter, maybe even a good one, but I let one gallery rejection convince me that art was a luxury I couldn't afford. I spent 30 years selling insurance and telling myself it was noble sacrifice, when really it was just fear dressed up as responsibility." Daniel sat down on the grass beside them, creating a triangle of connection around their father's grave. "He used to talk about you all the time after you stopped visiting," he said to Serenity, "about how proud he was that you became a teacher, about how you were sharing your gift with kids who might never discover they had artistic souls without you. But mostly he talked about how much he regretted not encouraging you to reach higher. I found something in his things after the funeral," Daniel continued, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, "a letter he never sent. I think you need to see it." The paper was worn soft from handling, as if their father had taken it out and read it many times without ever finding the courage to mail it. Serenity's name was written on the outside in his careful handwriting, and inside, in the same blue ink he'd used for insurance claims and grocery lists, were words that shattered and healed her heart simultaneously. "My dearest painter," the letter began, "I know I haven't always been the father your artistic spirit needed. I know my fears became chains around your dreams, and I know my own failures made me try to steer you away from the very thing that makes you most alive. But I want you to know that every painting you've ever shown me, from the finger-painted flowers you made in kindergarten to the landscape you gave me for my birthday last year, has been a window into a world more beautiful than anything I ever dared to imagine." The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing every piece of art she'd ever made that he'd secretly kept, every compliment from her teachers that had made him burst with pride, every moment he'd watched her paint and seen something sacred happening in the space between her imagination and the canvas. It ended with words that broke her heart and put it back together in the same breath. "I failed at my own dreams because I was afraid to be vulnerable enough to truly commit to them. Don't let my fear become your inheritance. The world needs your gift, and you need the courage to give it. Paint like your life depends on it. Because in all the ways that matter, it does. Love, Dad. He wrote that the night before he died, Daniel said quietly. He was going to ask me to deliver it, but he fell asleep and never woke up. I think he's been waiting for the right moment to give it to you himself. Serenity looked up at her father through tears that felt like they were washing away 3 years of accumulated grief and guilt. Why didn't you tell me this when you were alive? Why did you wait until it was too late to say these things? Because I was terrified that if I encouraged you and you failed, it would be my fault, he admitted. And because I was even more terrified that if I encouraged you and you succeeded, I'd have to face how completely I'd wasted my own life. It's easier to dim someone else's light than to find the courage to kindle your own. The voice that had been guiding Serenity through this impossible day spoke again, weaving through the conversation like a golden thread. This is what fear does. It makes us hoard love instead of sharing it, wisdom instead of teaching it, encouragement instead of giving it freely. Your father's fear created a legacy of doubt that you've been carrying like stones in your pockets. Oh, but love is stronger than fear, her father said, reaching out to touch her face with hands that felt real and warm despite being impossible. And forgiveness is stronger than regret. Can you forgive an old man who loved you so much he forgot how to show it? Can you forgive a daughter who was so angry about your doubt that she used it as an excuse to doubt herself? She replied, leaning into his touch like a child seeking comfort after a nightmare. There's nothing to forgive, he said simply. There's only love to remember, and courage to find, and dreams to chase with the time you have left. The air around them began to shimmer and pulse with a light that seemed to come from within their hearts, rather than from any external source. Daniel stood up and extended his hand to help Serenity to her feet, and when she took it, she felt a current of connection that had been missing from their relationship for far too long. I miss you, she said to her father, as he began to fade back into the shimmer of heat waves and possibility. I miss talking to you about everything except the things that mattered most. I'm always here, he replied, his voice becoming distant but no less loving. In every brushstroke you make, in every student you inspire, in every moment you choose courage over fear. Paint for both of us now. Paint like the world is waiting to see what miracles you can create. And as her father's presence dissolved back into the space between heartbeats, Serenity felt something shift in the deepest chambers of her heart. The frozen weight that had been pressing against her chest for 3 years began to melt, replaced by something warm and alive and infinitely possible. The world is starting to breathe again, the voice said softly. Can you feel it? And she could. The flowers on the grave were swaying more freely in the breeze that was no longer limited to this one sacred space. The plastic flowers on nearby graves were beginning to flutter. Even the frozen mourners seemed less rigid, as if they were taking deeper breaths in their suspended sleep. There's one more choice to make, the voice continued. One more person to forgive. One more heart to heal before time can flow freely again. Serenity looked around the cemetery, expecting to see another figure emerging from the impossible. But there was only herself and Daniel, and the growing sense that the world was holding its breath, waiting for her to understand something fundamental about the nature of love and time and second chances. Who? She asked, but even as the word left her lips, she already knew the answer. The hardest person to forgive was the one who had made all the fearful choices, who had walked away from love and hidden from dreams and spent 3 years living like a ghost in her own life. The hardest person to forgive was herself. And as she stood in that cemetery where time was learning to move again, surrounded by the love of the living and the dead, Serenity Thompson finally found the courage to look in the mirror of her own heart and choose forgiveness over fear, love over safety, and life over the comfortable numbness that had been slowly killing her spirit one careful day at a time. Standing in the cemetery with her brother's hand warm in hers, and her father's love still echoing in the space around his grave, Serenity felt the final wall around her heart begin to crumble. It wasn't a violent collapse, but a gentle melting, like ice giving way to spring water, like winter finally surrendering to the insistent promise of new growth. I forgive you, she whispered to herself, the words carrying the weight of 3 years of self-condemnation, and the lightness of finally setting down a burden she'd never meant to carry for so long. I forgive you for being human. I forgive you for being afraid. I forgive you for choosing safety over love and control over trust and loneliness over the risk of being hurt again. The moment the words left her lips, the world around them exploded into motion so sudden and complete that it felt like being inside a symphony that had been paused and suddenly resumed at full volume. The frozen mourners throughout the cemetery drew their first breaths in what felt like hours, their plastic flowers rustling in a breeze that swept across the entire city like a sigh of relief. Daniel squeezed her hand as the color returned to his face. No longer the ethereal figure who could move through frozen time, but simply her brother, solid and real, and blinking in confusion as he looked around the suddenly animated cemetery. "Serenity? What are you doing here? I thought you were at school." She laughed through her tears, a sound of pure joy that she hadn't heard from her own throat in longer than she could remember. "It's a long story, Danny. The longest, most impossible story you've ever heard." But before she could begin to explain what couldn't be explained, her phone buzzed in her pocket with a text message that made her heart stop all over again. The name on the screen was one she'd deleted and re-added a dozen times over the past 3 years, never finding the courage to reach out, but never quite ready to let go completely. Marcus. "I know this is crazy, and I know it's been 3 years, but I had the strangest dream about you last night. I dreamed that time stopped, and you were walking through the city, trying to find your way back to love. I know it sounds insane, but I found something under my couch this morning that I think belongs to you. Can we talk?" Attached to the message was a photo that made her knees weak. It was her engagement ring, the tiny diamond catching the morning light as it sat in Marcus's palm, like a question that had been waiting 3 years for an answer. The voice said, "Time would start again when I chose love over fear," she whispered to Daniel, showing him the phone with trembling hands. "I think it's time to make that choice." She typed back with fingers that shook but didn't hesitate. "Yes, we can talk. I have so much to tell you and even more to apologize for. Are you free now?" His response came immediately. "I've been free for 3 years. I'm at the studio." "What studio?" she typed, though some part of her already knew. "The one I leased for you before everything fell apart. I never could bring myself to give it up. I kept hoping that someday you'd want to paint again, and I'd have a place ready for you when you did." Serenity stared at the address he sent, the same studio the voice had shown her during their journey through frozen time. Somehow, impossibly, the vision had been real. Marcus had been waiting for her with a space full of northern light and possibility, just as the impossible voice had promised. "Danny, I have to go," she said, hugging her brother with an intensity that spoke of 3 years of missed embraces and unshared moments. "But can we have dinner tomorrow? Can we talk about Dad and art and all the things we should have been talking about all along?" "I'd like that," he said, hugging her back with equal fierceness. "I've missed you, Ren. I've missed having my sister in my life." She ran through the cemetery gates with a heart that felt like it was learning to beat for the first time, past cars that were once again moving through their normal rhythms, past birds that had remembered how to fly, and fountains that had found their voice again. The world was alive, gloriously and completely alive, and so was she. The studio was exactly as she'd seen it in the vision, down to the lease agreement still sitting on the windowsill with a line for her signature. But now Marcus was there too, standing in the center of the space with afternoon sunlight streaming through the north-facing windows, illuminating his face like a painting she'd dreamed of creating but never dared attempt. "You came," he said, his voice carrying 3 years of hope that he'd tried to bury but never quite managed to kill. "I'm sorry," she said, the words tumbling out before she could lose her courage. "I'm sorry I didn't listen. I'm sorry I let fear make my choices. I'm sorry I walked away from the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too scared to believe I deserved it. I'm sorry too," he replied, stepping closer but not quite close enough to touch. "I'm sorry I didn't know how to show you that your dreams mattered more to me than my fears. I'm sorry I let my practical side overshadow my ability to simply celebrate your gift." They stood in the center of the empty studio, two people who had loved each other imperfectly and lost each other completely, trying to find a way back to something that felt both familiar and entirely new. The engagement ring sat between them on a paint-stained table, no longer a symbol of promises broken, but of love that had endured despite every reason to give up. "I don't know if we can go back to what we were," Serenity said honestly. "We're different people now. 3 years of living with regret changes you in ways that can't be undone. I don't want to go back." Marcus replied, his eyes never leaving hers. I want to go forward. I want to discover who we are now, who we've become in all this time apart. I want to see what kind of love we can build when we're brave enough to choose it every day, instead of assuming it will always be there. She picked up the ring and held it to the light, watching the tiny diamond fracture the sunbeam into a dozen small rainbows that danced across the white walls of the studio. It was such a small stone, barely a quarter carat, but it had carried the weight of all their shared dreams and separate fears. If I put this back on, she said slowly, it won't be the same ring it was before. It won't represent the same promises or the same people. Are you okay with that? I'm counting on it, he said, reaching out to touch her face with the same gentle reverence she remembered from their first kiss. I want to marry the woman you've become, not try to resurrect the girl you used to be. She slipped the ring onto her finger, and this time it felt different. Not like a weight or a chain or even a promise, but like a reminder. A reminder that love was a choice she could make every day, that fear was an emotion she could feel without letting it control her decisions, that time was a gift meant to be filled with as much courage and creativity and connection as her heart could hold. So, what happens now? She asked, leaning into his touch and marveling at how something so simple could feel so revolutionary after 3 years of careful distance from anything that mattered. Now we paint, he said, gesturing to the easels and canvases that lined the walls of the studio. You paint everything you've been afraid to create. And I learned to be the kind of partner who celebrates your courage instead of trying to manage your risks. She kissed him then, not the desperate kiss of desperation or the careful kiss of reconciliation, but the kiss of two people who had learned the difference between loving someone and trusting love itself. It tasted like possibility and forgiveness, and the kind of hope that comes only after hope has been lost and found again. As the sun set over Phoenix, painting the studio walls in shades of gold and amber that would have made her father proud, Serenity Thompson picked up a paintbrush for the first time in 3 years. The voice that had guided her through impossible time whispered one final message in the space between her heartbeat and her first brush stroke. Time never stopped, child. Your heart did. Now you know the difference. And as she began to paint, filling the canvas with colors that had been sleeping in her soul for far too long, she understood that the miracle hadn't been the day time stopped. The miracle was this moment, when time started again, and she was brave enough to let it carry her toward a future filled with love and art, and the endless possibility of choosing courage over fear, one heartbeat at a time. Outside the studio windows, the world continued its ancient dance of minutes and hours and days. But inside this space filled with northern light and second chances, Serenity had finally learned to paint like her life depended on it. Because in all the ways that mattered, it did. 6 months later, Serenity stood in the Phoenix Contemporary Art Gallery, surrounded by 23 paintings that told the story of the day time stopped, and her heart remembered how to beat. The opening night crowd moved through the exhibition, with the hushed reverence usually reserved for cathedrals, their faces reflecting wonder at canvases that somehow captured the impossible experience of walking through a frozen world and finding love waiting on the other side. The centerpiece painting dominated the far wall, a massive canvas that showed a woman standing in an empty street with time suspended all around her, but her heart glowing like a small sun in her chest, warming everything it touched. Marcus stood beside her as gallery visitors whispered about the technical mastery and emotional depth of work that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries between art and miracle. The gallery owner wants to know if you have more pieces, Marcus said quietly, his arm around her waist as they watched an art critic from the Arizona Republic take notes in front of the painting titled, When Love Wakes Time. She's talking about a solo show in New York. Serenity smiled, her hand unconsciously moving to the small diamond on her finger that had become not just a symbol of their love, but a reminder of the day she learned that choosing love over fear could literally change the fabric of reality. Tell her I have a lifetime of paintings to make. Tell her I'm just getting started. Daniel approached them through the crowd, his eyes bright with tears as he looked at a smaller canvas near the entrance, a portrait of their father painting at an easel with ghostly figures of his daughter's future masterpieces floating around him like visible dreams. He would be so proud, Ren. He would be beside himself with pride. He is proud, she replied, knowing it was true in a way that had nothing to do with belief and everything to do with the love that transcends the boundaries between the living and the dead. I can feel it every time I pick up a brush. Mrs. Chen, her elderly neighbor who had become an unlikely friend after Serenity started visiting her weekly to paint portraits of her grandchildren, clutched her arm with hands that trembled with excitement. "The news people want to interview you," she whispered in heavily accented English. "They want to know about the inspiration for the exhibition." Serenity looked across the gallery at the reporters waiting with their cameras and microphones, ready to ask questions about technique and artistic vision, and the usual things that could be explained and analyzed and reduced to sound bites. How could she tell them that these paintings were documentation of the impossible? How could she explain that she had walked through a world where time had stopped, and love had taught her the difference between existing and living? "What will you tell them?" Marcus asked, understanding the complexity of her situation without needing it explained. "I'll tell them the truth," she said, surprising herself with the simplicity of the answer. "I'll tell them that art is the language we use to share experiences that can't be captured in words. I'll tell them that sometimes the most profound truths sound like fiction to people who haven't learned to see with their hearts instead of just their eyes." As if summoned by her words, the voice that had guided her through frozen time whispered one final message, audible only to her, but somehow blessing the entire evening with its presence. Every heart that sees these paintings will remember something they thought they had lost forever. Every person who truly looks will understand that miracles aren't violations of reality. They're invitations to remember what reality actually is. The reporter from Channel 12 approached with her cameraman, her professional smile masking genuine curiosity about the artist whose work seemed to glow with its own internal light. "Ms. Thompson, your paintings have an otherworldly quality that's generating a lot of buzz. Can you tell us about your inspiration?" Serenity looked directly into the camera, her eyes clear and calm as she spoke words that would be quoted in art magazines and spiritual blogs for years to come. "Love is the force that makes time meaningful. When we forget how to love, ourselves, each other, the gift of each moment we're given, time becomes just a series of empty minutes we endure instead of celebrate. These paintings are about remembering that every heartbeat is a choice between fear and love, between existing and truly living." "That's quite profound," the reporter said. "Do you consider yourself a spiritual artist?" "I consider myself a human being who learned that the spiritual and the practical aren't opposites," Serenity replied. "They're dance partners. Love is the most practical force in the universe because it's the only thing that actually creates lasting change. Everything else is just rearranging furniture in rooms that don't really matter." Later that evening, after the gallery had closed and the crowds had dispersed into the Phoenix night, Serenity and Marcus sat on the studio floor surrounded by the paintbrushes and canvases that had become their shared language of hope. The engagement ring caught the moonlight streaming through the north windows, but now it was accompanied by a simple gold wedding band that they had chosen together just 2 weeks earlier. "Do you ever wonder if it really happened?" Marcus asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her palm as they leaned against each other in the comfortable silence of two people who had learned to be fully present in each moment. "The daytime stopped? Or was it all some kind of metaphor your subconscious created to help you process 3 years of grief and regret?" Serenity considered the question seriously, as she had many times over the past 6 months. The rational part of her mind could construct elaborate explanations involving stress-induced hallucinations and coincidental timing and the power of suggestion. But the deeper part of her, the part that had learned to paint like her life depended on it, knew something that couldn't be reduced to psychological analysis. "It doesn't matter," she said finally. "What matters is that I'm here now, in this moment, choosing love over fear and creation over numbness and presence over the safe distance I used to keep from everything that mattered. Whether time actually stopped or my heart finally started, the result is the same. I'm alive in a way I forgot was possible." Outside their studio, Phoenix breathed with the rhythm of 8 million hearts, beating in sync with dreams and disappointments, hopes and fears, love and everything that masquerades as love, but falls short of its transforming power. And in this small space filled with canvases that captured impossible light and brushes still wet with liquid possibility, 2 people who had learned that second chances are always available to those brave enough to reach for them, continued the ancient work of turning love into art, and art into a bridge between the world as it is and the world as it could be. The last thing Serenity painted that night was a small canvas showing two hands reaching toward each other across a space that could have been measured in inches or years, with the simple title, "Time Starts Here," because she had finally learned that every moment of choosing love over fear was a moment when time remembered its true purpose. Not to count down to endings, but to count up to infinite new beginnings. What if time isn't actually moving forward, but we are? What if every moment we spend protecting ourselves from love, from risk, from the beautiful vulnerability of being fully human, is a moment we're choosing to live in slow motion, while the universe waits patiently for us to catch up? Serenity Thompson learned that the difference between existing and living isn't measured in heartbeats or hours, but in the courage to choose love when fear seems safer, forgiveness when resentment feels justified, and creation when destruction requires less energy. She discovered that miracles aren't violations of natural law, but reminders of what becomes possible when we align ourselves with the most powerful force in the universe, the decision to love without guarantees. Today, as you move through your own carefully constructed routines, ask yourself this question. If time stopped for everyone except you, what would you see that you've been too busy to notice? What conversations would you finally have? What forgiveness would you finally offer? What dreams would you finally chase? The beautiful truth is that you don't need time to stop to make different choices. You don't need the world to freeze to step out of the patterns that keep you small and scared, and separate from the life you're actually meant to live. Every breath is an opportunity to choose again. Every heartbeat is an invitation to love more bravely. Your time starts now. Your heart starts here. Choose love and watch the whole world come alive.